We turn now to the coronavirus pandemic. As the state struggles to control the virus, there has been a debate over how best to conduct a free and fair election in the middle of a pandemic.
After railing against mail-in voting, President Trump is now encouraging voters in Florida to vote by mail. CBS 4's Jim DeFede joins us now with more of his exclusive interview with Governor DeSantis, where he spoke about the state's vote-by-mail system. Jim.
Lauren, you mentioned that presidential tweet that went out earlier today. It caught a number of people by surprise, the fact that he sort of reversed course about being able to trust the voting system in Florida. Ironically, this was one of the issues that I addressed in my interview with Governor DeSantis yesterday, where I wanted to find out exactly whether or not he supported, mail-in balloting, and this is what he had to say. Do you have any problems with vote by mail in the state of Florida?
Well, see, I think that this is important because I think there's a confusion. In Florida, if you want to vote by mail, you request, you call the supervisor, you send an email, you submit a form, and then they send it to you. I think the places where we've seen real problems, where it's just indiscriminate mail ballots being sent everywhere, flooding, regardless of whether you've asked for it or not. We do not have that in Florida. I do not support going to that model in Florida. I do think the model we have, where you can request, you don't have to be sick or out, you just, no excuse absentee. I think that that's been successful, and I think that it's had integrity.
We've seen problems in some local elections in South Florida where, with the virus, you may have trouble getting people into polling locations and staffing enough polling locations. Will you be encouraging people to actually take advantage of vote by mail?
Well, they should do that, but we also know there's a lot of voters who want to vote in person. I mean, that's just the reality. So we have made preparations to augment any of the poll workers and the staffing should there be shortfalls. And I've told the Secretary of State, and we need to have a lot of people ready on the ground. So yes, request your ballot. You'll get it. It's safe, and every Floridian should know that. But if you do want to vote in person, we're going to make sure the polls are open.
All right, so you heard it just there from the governor. Jim, any idea why the president reversed course on vote by mail?
This is really interesting, Lauren. Vote by mail in Florida is actually an invention of the Republican Party. It dates all the way back to when Jeb Bush was governor. The Republican Party saw a real advantage to vote by mail. They relied upon it. It's one of the reasons why they've held power across most of the branches of state government for the last 20 years, just about. And so what you realize was that the president's comments were actually putting Republicans in the state in a bad position and hurting his own chance of winning the state. And let me just give you one statistic. Right now, 600,000 more Democrats have requested absentee ballots for this fall than Republicans. Seeing that sort of numbers, I think, scared the president and made him reverse course.
And Jim, I understand you also spoke to the governor about some new guidance that the state is going to give employers about people who test positive for the virus. So what did he tell you about that?
Yeah, this is really, really interesting stuff. We sort of got a preview of what the Florida Department of Health is likely to be releasing in the next day or two, which is going to be guidance that in part comes from the CDC about whether or not people who have previously tested positive should get another test before going back to work. But our conversation started by talking about the failures of testing and the inability to do contact tracing in the state. And here's where the conversation picks up with the governor.
It's going to be very difficult to do contact tracing if I can't tell you in a PCR test whether an asymptomatic carrier actually has live virus. And we now know you can't do that. I think at the beginning, we tended to think if you test positive, you have live virus. Well, now we've seen people that'll test positive 30 days, and CDC says up to 12 weeks. So that makes the contact tracing of asymptomatic very difficult. Even if you got an immediate turnaround, it would still be somewhat difficult, but a 7-day turnaround just makes it very difficult.
That's the second time you've cited this CDC study that talks about live virus or dead virus remaining in the system for 12 weeks. I talked to a number of epidemiologists and folks who study infectious diseases, and that is not clear to them. So with that study in your mind, do you foresee, for instance, saying that it's okay for a person who has a positive test to go back to work if it's been a week or 2 or 3 weeks since their positive test.
Well, that's what CDC's guidance is.
But is that what is your guidance?
No, exactly. So we're going to follow their guidance. So basically, it's a symptom-based approach. If you test positive, you obviously isolate. But then if you have had a certain number of days, I think it's between 10 and 14, depending on the circumstances, with no symptoms, or the symptoms have subsided, no fever, then there's a pathway for you to go back.
So this is going to be a new policy that you're going to be implementing.
Well, this is the guidance we're going to give to employers. I mean, we're not obviously requiring, we've never necessarily required a negative test except for nursing home situations and a few others. Most of the employers, though, have been doing the negative PCR test. And I think CDC's guidance is we should focus more on a symptom-based approach rather than a test-based approach. And I think that that's probably the better way to go. So, yeah, we're going to follow that. I think the Department of Health is putting out some guidance on that today. It's not necessarily mandatory, but I think most employers will look at that and probably feel that's a little bit more flexible.
Do you run the risk of confusing people who may say to themselves, I tested positive for the virus, but does my positive test really mean anything? You see what I'm saying? In other words,
well, but at the same time, I mean, as we get new information, I think we have to be honest about what that data is telling us. So, for example, if we were sitting here in the beginning of March, I mean, I would have thought a positive test was like, man, you're definitely, and then just we've learned more about kind of the limits of the PCR testing. I think for sure, if you are experiencing coronavirus symptoms and you test positive, you have live virus. I think if you have no symptoms, there is a question about whether we can tell you definitively whether you have live virus based on this.
All right, Jim, so do we know when this new guidance is going to go into effect, and will it be mandatory?
So as the governor said, it will not be mandatory, but it will go into effect supposedly in the next few days, possibly as early as tomorrow. The State Department of Health will be putting it out there. And I learned one other thing late today is that one of the things that the governor did was he got this from talking to the vice president as part of the coronavirus task force meetings. So these are one of the things that the federal government is talking about and they're trying to push out. I have not been aware, though, of any other state in the country that has done this.
You've also spoken to some health experts, Jim, and this could actually be proven to be controversial, won't it?
Yeah, so let's take it as a practical application. So at CBS, if you test positive for coronavirus, you cannot come back to work until you have at least one, sometimes two negative tests in a row in a 24-hour period. There are a number of businesses that do that. What the governor is saying and what the policy that they're going to be recommending going forward is for employers to ignore that, and that if a person is not showing symptoms, if they tested positive but do not have symptoms for 10 days, they should then go back to work. That the employer should have them come back and start working. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that some people in our office and in other offices might not want to work next to someone who has not been retested. One of the outcomes of this is we could be seeing fewer tests because they're going to start telling people, you don't need another test. If you simply don't have symptoms, don't worry about getting another test to see if you're still positive. Just go back to work. Now, the governor's office told me late today when I pressed them more on this to follow up, they said that a number of hospitals are already taking this approach with their own employees, and they think this is going to be the new standard to follow symptoms, not tests. It's sort of de-emphasizing tests and just looking at symptoms. As I said, I think it's going to be controversial. I think you're going to see some pushback in the days ahead.
All right, Jim, a lot of important and insightful information coming out of your interview there with the governor. Thank you so much tonight. And of course, we invite you at home to watch Jim's entire hour-long exclusive interview with Governor Ron DeSantis. It's posted on our website, cbsmiami.com.